Moving into Chapter 5, Defense as a National Military Philosophy, the natural prey of the intelligence community, and letting you know that this is what doing the work looks like. Meaning, you do the work when you don't want to do the work. Meaning, everything inside me is saying, don't go rest, because I've made over 50, 60, 70 videos today. However, I'm responsible for gifting information, and I'm doing the work anyways. It doesn't always look the prettiest, but at least it's the work, isn't it? Okay, let's go. Chapter 5. Following the establishment of the National Intelligence Authority, about 18 months passed in which the DCI was deeply involved in setting up some organizations that could effectively coordinate national intelligence. This was easier said than done. The old scars of the war period had not healed, and nothing Admiral Sowers could do would heal them. At that time, the subordinate organizations were undergoing their own post-war organizational problems. The Department of State had set up an intelligence section under Colonel McCormick, and then the Congress severely cut his funds in favor of the new Central Intelligence Group. He resigned and left things in bad shape, but some headway was made and important legislation was passing that, if it passed, would provide for the creation of an agency of some merit. At this point, the fighting got pretty heavy. It would be hard to recreate the hopes and the very real fears of those post-war years. It is one thing to win a major war and to end up victorious as the greatest military power ever created. It is an entirely different thing to realize that this great military force had been suddenly made obsolete by a totally new weapon of major proportions. During the long evolution of warfare, changes in the art of war had come about rather slowly. A thrown rock extended the range of hostility over the bare fist, then the sling gave the rock thrower more range. The sword made the right arm more lethal, and then the spear gave more range to the sword. Changes in weapons and changes in tactics were generally matters of degree. During World War I, the advent of the armored tank vehicle ushered in mechanized warfare, and the utilization of rapid-fire weapons made the proximate lines of the hostile perimeter between two powers a variable and literal no man's land. Before the end of World War I, the airplane had extended the range of reconnaissance and air battles, and aerial bombardment gave evidence of the path of the future for aviation and for warfare in three dimensions. During the years between World War I and World War II, the greatest debates on military strategy and tactics were fought over the use of the new war weapon system. It was typical that the land and the sea arms wished to cling to tradition and felt it necessary to play down the role of aviation. World War II cleared up these arguments, and by the end of the global encounter, the airplane had become, if not the primary weapon of warfare, at least the major weapon of the war arsenal of the nation. Then, just as a quarter century of sometimes violent argument over the establishment of an independent air force came to an end and the whole world became accustomed to conventional warfare, the atomic bomb threw a new dimension into the picture. No longer would any major warfare be conventional in the sense that it would be taking place during World War II. If all of the techniques, weapons, and tactics of the ages were to be arranged into one spectrum of forces, and then this total force matched against the atomic bomb alone, the bomb would have made all prior weaponry seem like a rock and a club. World War II ended unknowable and the unthinkable, or so it seemed to many. In this climate, the post-war years were not relaxing. The aging men who had brought the country through the Great Depression and then who had led it through the greatest wars were now weary and suddenly old. They had hoped to leave to the world a legacy of peace and prosperity. Many years later, Wendell Willkie had preached the concept of one world. He, like Charles A. Lindbergh, had traveled the world and had seen that if there was to be lasting peace, men would have to think and practice one world. But the dream faded into the dawn of the war as the world was broken into two armed camps representing the Western world and the Axis powers. And in the case of the Western world included the Soviet Union, which the Roosevelt government had recognized back in 1933, and which it had joined during World War II in the total struggle against Italy, Germany, and Japan. With the war over, with Harry Truman wearing the mantle of peacemaker, his Secretary of State, James Burns, was again preaching one world and was trying to convince the world that the United States would never divide it, and the day would never be seen again when mankind would have to resort to war. He was not only echoing the feelings of the pre-war dreamers, but he was attempting realistically to face a nuclear age. Nothing that had occurred before throughout the history of mankind had ever overhung the entire human race as portentously as did the atom bomb. There could be no letdown from the global responsibility, which had become as heavy and burden in peacetime as it had been during the war. During 1946, the United States was grimly aware of the fact that it was the sole processor of the bomb and that this was to be far only a fleeting time. Scientists knew, even if the statesmen and politicians did not wish to know, that the secret of the bomb had already ended on the day it had been exploded over Hiroshima, and that it was inevitable that Russia and other countries would have the bomb within a few years. Therefore, on one hand, there was a great rush to establish and structure the end as man's last best hope for peace. At the same time, there was a beginning of a great and growing witch hunt in the U.S. concerning the protection of the secrets of the atomic bomb. Related to this was a demand for information from all over the world to make it possible for the U.S. to know the exact status of the development of the bomb by other powers. And related to all of these problems was the growing awareness of the danger that would arise from the growth and spread of communism. Some of these concerns were real and many were imagined. I recall having been in the Soviet Union during World War II. I had entered the country by way of Tehran, Iran, and flown mountains near Baku. Then our course took us further north over Makhachkala and northwesternly along the Manich River to Rostov. Although I had seen many bombed and burned cities during the war, from Italy to Manila and Tokyo, I had never seen anything to compare with the absolute devastation of Rostov. From there, we flew toward Kiev to the city of Poltava, where we landed and remained for a few days. Our return was over essentially the same route. Since I had been free to fly a varied course, I flew at about 500 feet above the ground for the entire trip, and wandered, of course, right and left as random cities and towns came into view. The major lesson from such a flight was that the war areas of Russia had been terribly destroyed by the German onslaught and by the Russian scorched earth policy. The other outstanding factor was that over this 1,500-mile area of the Russian heartland, there was absolutely no roads. There were trails and horse land. There were absolutely no roads. There were trails and a horse or farm vehicle paths, but no roads of any kind. There were a major railroad and the Great Manic Canal. In 1944, one could observe that Russia was going to have to recover from a devastating war and was going to have to make a major effort to develop its backward economic base, which without modern road transportation would certainly be limited in its growth. It was clear that when the great anti-communist hue and cry began only 2 years later, it was founded more on the potential danger of Russia as a developer of an atom bomb capability than it was on Russia's potential threat to the United States. The result of the communist threat emotionalism was to create in the minds of Americans and others in the Western world the image of a Soviet monster, which was only part flesh and mostly fantasy. However, it was just this sort of thing that played into the hands of those alarmists who supported a movement to create a strong central intelligence authority with clandestine operational powers. There were then several factors that came together in support of creation of a central intelligence agency. The administration had seen the woeful deficiency of uncoordinated intelligence as practiced during World War II. Also, the administration saw the real importance and necessity for a strong intelligence arm of the president as a result of the new pressures of the nuclear age. However, the early Truman administration was trying to provide leadership for the one world defined by Secretary of State James Burns, and to keep the world from being torn into armed camps again so shortly after the war. In spite of their efforts, the resounding warning issued by the great wartime orator Winston Churchill took its toll, and within 1 year after he had delivered his Iron Curtain speech, lines had been drawn, and the issue became one of communism versus anti-communism. The events that turned all of this around during 46 and 47 were not the subject of this book, but certainly the British notification to the United States that it was going to withdraw its support of the Greeks and the Turks in their struggles for survival against communism did, as well as Churchill's speech to raise the banner of the Truman Doctrine and to expand Churchill's wall from the Balkans across the northern tier. By 1948, the Truman administration was no longer advocating with it, had preached in early 1946. All of these pressures, and they were great pressures that at that crucial time played a major part in the decision to create the Central Intelligence Agency and in the behind-the-scenes battles that were incidental to the passage of the law. By the time the lines had hardened, few would deny the necessity for central coordinated intelligence, and nearly everyone was convinced that the quality of national intelligence must be improved. However, as strongly as these measures were supported, the majority also denied that proposals that would have given the intelligence authority its own clandestine branch and the means to support such activities. General Donovan, Allen Dulles, and others took to the rostrum and spoke publicly and privately of the need, as they saw it, for an agency with special operations powers to confirm this need and to inflame the public with this issue. The supporters of the clandestine operations proposition became the greatest firebrands of the anti-communist theme. It was this same group that picked up the banner hurled by Winston Churchill and that saw communists under every rock. It was during these crucial days that the opposition, no matter who the opposition was painted pink or red with the label of communist. The beginning of this form of public and political blackmail was made during these debates, and it reached its zenith less than a decade later in the infamous days of Senator Joseph McCarthy. In the quarter century that was followed this debate, this country and the world have become somewhat accustomed to the polemics of this terrible issue. What began perhaps as an honest effort to alert this country to the fact that the Soviet government did in fact have the potential to unleash the secrets of the atom and thus to build atomic bombs gradually became a powerful tool in the hands of irresponsible and the agitators. All oppositions, for whatever reason, was branded as communist or pro-communist. Gradually, this dogma of anti-communism was extended into the entire world, and by the time of the publication of the Truman Doctrine, the entire world had been divided into communist and anti-communist along the lines of the Iron Curtain, the Northern Tier, and the Bamboo Curtain. Once these lines had been drawn, it remained only for time to run its course and for the Soviet Union to follow natural growth and scientific achievement to obtain not only the atomic bomb, but the hydrogen bomb and then the intercontinental ballistic missile. As many have said, these decisions and pressures, which first appeared during the years immediately followed the end of the war, too, have contained some of the most serious and grievous mistakes in this quarter century. Certainly, the blind anti-communism can be listed as one of the most costly, especially when received in terms of the waste and senselessness of the action in Indochina. The first great fault with the drift of opinion at that time became evident in the very shift of emphasis with regard to the national military establishment. Throughout our history, the idea of war had been treated as a positive action. War was the last resort of a nation after all means of diplomacy had failed to impress its might and its will upon another, and throughout our proud history, we never had faced the war as something passive or reactive, but somehow in this post-war era, this nation began to think of war as defense and then as defense alone. In other words, in the defense philosophy, we were not telling the world that the most powerful nation in the world was showing its magnanimity and restraint. We were saying that we would defend only. And to the rest of the world, that meant that we were going to play a passive role in the world affairs and that we were passing the active role. And with it, the initiative to others, in this case, to the men in the Kremlin. We not only said this as we disestablished the traditional War Department, but we have done it throughout the intervening 25 years by developing the capability to search out the action of an enemy and then by responding. This defensive posture of our military and foreign policy has been a terrible mistake, and it opened the doors for the newborn intelligence community to move in and take over the control of U.S. foreign military policy. Despite the heat and pressure of the intelligence lobby in 1946 and 1947, the National Security Act of 1947 did not contain specific authorization of the new agency to become involved in clandestine operations. In July of 1947, Congress passed the National Security Act, and when President Truman signed it into law, this act became effective September 18, 1947. It was the most important piece of legislation to have passed since World War II, More money has been spent, more lives influenced, and more national prestige and tradition affected by one law than anything that has been done since that date. And all in the futile and passive name of defense. In this single act, Congress established the Department of Defense, and in its single civilian secretary, it established a new military organization, joining the old Army and a Navy with an independent Air Force and Joint Chiefs of Staff. It also set up the National Security Council, which consisted of the President and Vice President, the Secretaries of State and of Defense, and the Director of the Office of Emergency Planning. It provided for the Operations Coordinating Board to assure that the decisions arrived at within the NSC were carried out as planned and directed. And not to be overlooked, this same act created the CIA and very specifically placed it for the purpose of coordinating the intelligence activities of the several government departments and agencies in the interest of national security under the direction of the National Security Council. And a law that already invited the creation of some power center to arise and take over the direction of the military establishment. Because the organization was by definition passive, the Congress left the door wide open by placing the precocious new baby under the direction of a committee. In the context of the period, there could have been no doubt that it was the intention of the Congress and of the administration, and this new Central Intelligence Authority was to perform in its primary function the role of coordinator of information and no more. Agency protagonists, many of whom have made a career of stretching the language of the law, have always attempted to belittle the significance of the restrictive and delineating language. Lyman Kirkpatrick, the longtime very able executive director of the CIA, speaks for his very parochial school of thought in his excellent book, The Real CIA, as follows. Many of those who believe that the CIA has too much power or does things that he should not do claim that this clause shows the intent of Congress and the CIA should only coordinate the activities of the other agencies and should not be engaged in collection of or action itself. This is a shrewd way to put it. He would have his readers believe that only those who believe that the CIA has too much power are the ones who read the law properly. The truth of the matter is that anyone who reads the law and who has also takes the trouble to research the development of the language of the law will see that Congress meant just what it said, and that the CIA was created for the purpose of coordinating the intelligence activities of the several government departments and agencies and no more. When the greatest proponent of the Central Intelligence Authority, General William J. Donovan, prevailed upon President Roosevelt to establish such an organization in 1941, the office was established by General Donovan, as its head was no more than the Office of Coordinator of Information. This office paved the way for the wartime Office of Strategic Strategies. At the end of the war, President Truman abolished that office and shortly thereafter set up another National Intelligence Authority in January of 1946, again for the purpose of coordinating intelligence. It will be noted that the specific duties assigned to the new agency specially itemized most of the standard tasks of intelligence, with the exception of collection. It would seem that a Congress that had debated the subject so long and so thoroughly would not have overlooked the function of collection. It is more likely that Congress fully intended that it stated that the task of the CIA was that of coordinating intelligence. The duties of the CIA were set forth in the law as follows: to advise the National Security Council in matters concerning such intelligence activities of the government departments and agencies to relate to national security, to make recommendations to the NSC for the coordination of such intelligence activities. I'm sorry, I'm laughing at a free video I did earlier. It's funny as crap. It's true and funny. It's hysterical. It's a comedy. To correlate and evaluate intelligence relating to the national security and provide for the appropriate decimation of such intelligence within the government, provided that the agency shall have no police, subpoena, law enforcement powers, or internal security functions. To perform for the benefit of the existing intelligence agency such additional services of common concern in the NSC determines can be more efficiently accomplished centrally. To perform with such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the NSC may from time to time direct. For those familiar with the language used in legislative writing, it should be very clear that Congress knew exactly what it was doing when it set up the central authority to coordinate intelligence and when it further delineated the responsibility into those 5 brief and explicit paragraphs shown above. Let's consider that the internet is included in that as a new advancement in what the government has been up to with the internet. Yet few such uncomplicated and simple lines defined in the law of the land have ever been subject to so much misinterpretation, intentional and accidental, as have these. Anyone who has read the book of Alan Dulles and of his executive director, Lyman Kirkpatrick, will find that they just cannot bring themselves to quote these simple lines verbatim. They have to paraphrase them and cite them with brief but absolutely essential omissions of key words, or add them to the explanations that are certainly not in the language of the law. Let us look at a few of these important details. The law established the Department of Defense as a full and permanent part of the government, with a continuing corporate existence and full power and authority to budget for its own funds and to expend them for its own use year after year. The law very specifically placed the CIA under direction of a committee, the NSC, to serve its direction. In its sense, the NSC was to be the operating body, and the CIA was to serve it. This may appear to be a small distinction, but had things worked out this way and had strong and continuing leadership come from the NSC, including the office of the president, the agency would not have become what Harry Truman has called a symbol of sinister and mysterious foreign intrigue. This distinction is one of leadership. It may have seemed in 1947 that a committee consisting of the President, Vice President, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Defense would be strong enough to keep the fledgling agency under control, but no committee is stronger than its weakest, or in its case, its busiest member. As planned, the agency was supposed to become involved in clandestine activity only at the direction of NSC, if ever. It was not considered that the agency would get involved in clandestine activities, but approval of the NSC. However, as the agency found the weakness and began to probe it, it remained for the members of the NSC to have the strength of their convictions and the courage to say no. So proud of the Jets today. The record shows that this was the case on several occasions in the late 40s, but as the agency grew in size, powers, and willingness, it found its way around the committee's horse collar. If the Congress had any intention of permitting the CIA to evolve into a major operational agency, it certainly would not have placed it under the direction of a committee. It is not enough to say that it's a choice of the NSC was made because of this would mean that the CIA would have then be safely under the eye of the president. This is what General Donovan wanted, but he and the other strong operational CIA proponents did not want even the NSC, Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense between the CIA and the president. By assigning the CIA to the NSC, Congress was attempting to make the NSC itself an operational organization from this limited purpose. It may not have intended this, since we feel strongly that Congress did not visualize any clandestine operations under any setup, and then when it gave the NSC the responsibility to direct the CIA, it left the NSC with the task of directing the agency if the time ever arose when clandestine operations were to be mounted, and as history reveals, that time was not far away. The agency saw to that itself. Later events understood the major significance of the NSC responsibility for the CIA. Truman and Eisenhower utilized the NSC as a personal staff. The uses these presidents made of it were individual and distinct from each other, but they did utilize it along the general conceptual lines inherent in the National Security Act of 1947. Eisenhower used it as strong military type staff and then leaned upon the Operations Coordinating Board to see the directives were carried out in accordance with the desires. When Kennedy became president, he almost totally ignored the NSC and abandoned the OCB. Either he threw aside the NSC because he thought of it as the Eisenhower era antiquity, or he simply may not have completely understood the function of what kind of staff operation. Whatever his reasons, he certainly left the door wide open for the CIA. With no NSC, There was a major reason why Kennedy never received the kind of staff support he should have before the Bay of Pigs, and why he was unable to get proper control afterwards. It even explains why Kissinger's role has become so dominant in the Nixon administration after the long years of unfettered Maxwell Taylor and McGeorge Bundy residency in the White House as a key men for the CIA operating almost without the NSC in control. As time and events have eroded and shaped the application of the interpretations of this law, the agency has tended to be decreasingly effective in the area of coordinating national intelligence, especially since the emergence of its greatest rival and counterpart, the Defense Intelligence Agency. It has become increasingly operational as it has succeeded in working itself out under the strictures of the NSC. The success or failure of the next four listed duties of the CIA as set forth in the Act are related, often inversely, or the activity of the agency under whatever type of NSC existed during the administration of the several presidents, according to Harry Howe Ransom in his book, Can American Democracy Survive the Cold War? Can American democracy survive the Cold War? Within the Act itself, Congress specified that the NSC should advise the president with respect to the integration of domestic, foreign, and military policies among the various government departments and agencies, including the military, and to assess and appraise the objectives, commitments, and risks of the United States in relation to our actual potential military power, to show how the NSC was created within the atmosphere of that time. Ransom states the principal role specified for NSC in the statute was not to make final decisions, but to advise the president to make his national security policy and administrative task more efficient. But whenever the bureaucracy is institutionalized and centralized, there is the risk of minimizing the discretion and flexible maneuverability of the presidency. And this in turn can adversely affect both the common defense and the fulfillment of the democratic ideal. Many see too much unchecked presidential power as the main threat to freedom, but this does not appear to be the real danger in modern American government, with the important possible exception of executive control over the flow of information. I would say that the current riskiest thing is celebrity and social media influencers. Celebrity females and social media influencers are the most deadly. And entrepreneurs, those people who are spouting off bullcrap on the internet about politics, that's the most dangerous. It is the president's inability to rise above the decision-making machinery and to exert responsibility, leadership to the national interest, perceived from the highest level, to place the basic democratic idea in doubt. As Ransom points out, at the first meeting of the NSC in 1947, President Truman indicated that he regarded it as his council, that is to say, as a purely advisory body. Later, President Eisenhower, although inclined to regard it as a council, made clear nonetheless the NSC was absolved of any responsibility per se for national decisions. The NSC advises a responsibility for decision is the president's, insisted Eisenhower. President Kennedy came to office with an apparent bias against the kind of use Eisenhower made of NSC, born into office on a great chorus of rhetoric about the need for purposeful, energetic presidential leadership. Kennedy at first made little use of the council as a formal advisory body. Following the 1961 Cuban fiasco, however, the NSC was restored somewhat. In a very precedent paragraph, Ransom shows how important this grasp for power by an inner secret team was becoming as far back as 1952, even as the NSC was getting started. A struggle for control of that body was underway, and the control was to be elected by gradually making the advisory committee into an operating power center. Ransom's comment is worth repeating here. Early in NSC's life, according to President Truman, one or two of its members tried to change it into an operating super cabinet on the British model. Truman identifies the members as his first two secretaries of defense, Forrestal and Johnson, who would sometimes, Truman recounts, put pressure on NSC's executive secretary to use NSC authority to see the various governmental agencies were following NSC policy. The executive secretary declined to do this on the ground that his was an advisory staff rather than an executive line function. Truman fought to keep the subordinate nature of NSC clear to all, emphasizing that Congress had in fact changed the title of NSC Director to Executive Secretary. Forrestal had, Truman notes, advocated using the British cabinet system as a model for the operation of post-war. American government to change the system, wrote Truman, he would have to change the Constitution, and I think we have been doing very well under our Constitution. No, we're going to change it. We're changing the Constitution, just to let everybody know. Modernizing the Constitution. We're going to finish chapter 5 on the next video.